From the Penn Institute for Urban Research and the Volcker Alliance, this is Special Briefing. I'm Bill Glasgall, and I'm here with my good friend Susan Wachter, co-director here at Penn IUR. Hello, Susan.
Hello there, Bill, and it certainly looks like a good news day.
It's certainly and a lot of news, and we'll be getting into it right now because today we'll be pondering the U.S. economy and where it's headed with the Strait of Hormuz declared open and shipping starting to move again. And we'll be looking at how states and municipalities and the $4 trillion muni bond market, how they're navigating this volatile economic period as many states get set to enact their budgets for fiscal 2027. Two super economists, Mark Zandi of Moody's Analytics and Julia Coronado of MacroPolicy Perspectives, will kick off today's discussion. And I can't wait to hear what they're going to say. But first, it's a brief message. Special briefings are made possible by funding from the Travelers Institute, the Volcker Alliance, and members of the Penn IUR Advisory Board. Thanks to you all. And we're coming to you on the Penn IUR and Volcker Alliance websites, and also on the Special Briefing podcast and the Penn IUR YouTube channel. You can catch us almost everywhere. And now, along with Mark and Julia today, we'll be joined by Mayor Kim Norton, making a return visit to us from City Hall in beautiful Rochester, Minnesota. For what's happening in the states, which are still pretty flush with cash, we'll hear from Brian Sigritz, Director of State Fiscal Studies at the National Association of State Budget Officers. You see them up on the screen there. And finally, for the view from the muni market, welcome back to Natalie Cohen, President and founder of National Municipal Research. And so to get us going, got a lot of news today. Let me turn the mic over to Susan to introduce Mark Zandi.
Mark, it's so good to have you back, good friend. And of course, we do want to hear in this time of great uncertainty, moment to moment, what's your views on the economy?
Thanks, Susan. Thanks, Bill. It's good to be with you and the rest of the folks on the panel. Remind me, Susan, how long did you want me to speak for? 3 hours? Was it
3 hours would be terrific, but unfortunately, we only have 7 minutes. Thank you.
7 minutes? Okay, that's plenty of time. I appreciate the opportunity. Well, thank you. And I think I'd begin by saying the economy is growing. It's moving forward, but it's a very fragile growth. And today's events notwithstanding, and I'll come back to that in a minute. I think that continues to be the case, that the growth is evident in GDP, the value of all the things that we produce that's growing after you abstract from the vagaries of the data, the ups and downs and all arounds, which are considerable, somewhere around 2 to 2.5%, which is, that's okay. It's not bad. It's positive, but it's below the economy's potential. After you consider productivity and labor force growth, we should be growing 2.5 to 3%. And that's why it's a fragile growth. It's not enough to generate enough jobs to maintain even stable unemployment. Unemployment is steadily moving higher, and we aren't creating any jobs. Job growth has come to a virtual standstill. The only sector of the economy that's adding to payrolls is the healthcare sector. Outside of that, we're not going anywhere fast. So, the economy is hanging in there, but I'd say it's a very, very tentative hanging in there. The outlook is going to be largely determined by how two broad forces play out here. The first is going back to the war in Iran. That is ostensibly moving in the right direction. It feels like it's headed towards a more positive resolution, but there's a lot of script to still be written here, and oil prices are still elevated. And even under the best of scenarios, I don't see them going back to kind of pre-war levels. So just to give you some numbers, before the war, the price for a barrel of oil was 65 bucks a barrel. It got as high as 115 bucks a barrel, 120. We're now back down to 85, 90. And if you told me, again, if everything roughly plays out reasonably gracefully, that we end the year around 80 bucks a barrel, 80, 85 bucks a barrel, I say that sounds about right. And that goes to just the elevated risks of operating in the region. It's just going to be, there's going to be a significant risk premium built into price. Insurance companies are going to require a higher premium to pay for the risks that they face in insuring the tankers that move through the strait. And of course, there's a lot of damage that's been done to the energy and other infrastructure in the region, which is going to limit supplies. So I think we'll see some relief, but we're not going back. And just to give you context, every $10 per barrel increase in the price of oil raises inflation in the subsequent year by 20 basis points, and it reduces growth by 10 to 15 basis points. So you can kind of do the arithmetic. It's not if the price of oil follows the path I've just articulated, well, it's not great. It causes higher inflation. It reduces economic growth. It freezes the Fed in place because the Fed doesn't know whether to react to the weaker economy or respond to the stronger growth. They would imply different things about monetary policy, but it's manageable. But obviously, there's a ton of risk around that. And just to give you a little bit more context, by our calculations, if the price of oil, if these recent events don't play out in as graceful a way as I'm anticipating, and the strait remains disrupted ongoing, to get a recession, we're not that far away. Oil would have to rise to about $125 a barrel over the next few months, settle in around $100 by the end of the year. If that were the scenario, and I think that's still a risk that we need to consider, that would be enough to push this economy, this fragile economy, into an economic downturn. Of course, there's also sources of growth, and I do want to mention that before I end, and that is artificial intelligence, AI. That is driving a lot of economic activity, did so in 2025 and continues to do so in 2026. And that is occurring through really two channels. The first is through all of the investment, the data centers and all of the things that go into the data centers, the power, the investment in power that's necessary to drive the data centers. All of that is adding significantly to economic growth. And then there's also the second channel is the wealth effects being generated by the run-up in equity prices, which we were seeing today. The stock market's now back at a record high. A lot of that's being driven by the stock prices of AI companies or AI-related companies, and that is lifting wealth for the well-to-do, which is resulting in increased consumer spending by that group. I think those two things will continue to be tailwinds to economic growth and allow the economy to move forward. But again, a boatload of risk around that as well. Obviously, the equity market is very richly valued, and the potential risk of correcting at some point. And there's also the ongoing concern about the pace at which AI is adopted and the impact that has on productivity. And if we're in a world already with no job growth and we see AI productivity growth kicking into a higher gear, that may lead to some job loss, which would be, I think, pretty hard for the economy to digest. So you add it all up, it's an economy that's okay. It's moving forward, but it's a very tentative, fragile economy. And the crosswinds that are playing out here, the headwind of the Iran war and the tailwind of artificial intelligence, are highly uncertain. And I suspect that means that 2026 will be much like 2025, a year of growth, but a very, very tentative and fragile growth.
Thank you so much, Mark. Tentative growth nonetheless, but points of concern potentially even on this good news day. Julia, what do you make of the day and bigger broad perspective? But let me again introduce Julia, who is founder and president of MacroPolicy Perspectives. Julia, great to have you with us.
It's a real pleasure to be here, Susan. Thank you for having me on this webinar. I enjoy the conversation always. So I think my outlook is not wildly different from Mark's. We saw growth continue last year, despite concerns that it might slow further or even go into a recession after the tariff shock of last April. And part of that was because the tariffs were pulled back from extreme initially announced levels. And part of it was, as Mark outlined, the dual channel of the AI tailwind, both through increased investment and also a wealth effect in the stock market through to wealthy consumers. So growth slowed, but it stayed resilient. And the question is the resilience of the US economy something that's sort of innate and intact, or are we more vulnerable to shocks like the war in Iran? I would say our initial forecast before the war was still for some slowing, largely reflecting a essential stop in labor supply. So between the aging of the population, the domestic population, and restrictive immigration policies, we don't have any labor supply anymore. Labor supply is effectively zero, which is one of the ingredients to the accounting for GDP growth. It's labor supply plus productivity. So one element is zero. So we had a forecast for another sort of moderate slowing in GDP growth in 2026. When we looked at the shock from the war, we sort of factored in kind of some resolution. A complete stop of the Strait of Hormuz is just simply catastrophic for the global economy. So eventually the parties were going to find a way to open that, and we would have some relief in oil prices. I agree with Mark. We're likely to see those prices stay elevated. The strait is open, but the conflict is still in negotiation, and there are not easy solutions here. So the likelihood of setbacks and or some impairment that persists are high. So we are going to experience the shock from higher energy prices, and that will ripple through to other input costs and fertilizer and other chemicals. So that will take a bite out of growth. We had initially assessed that it would take about 0.4 out of growth. So now our forecast is for GDP to grow about 1.5% in the US this year. But keep in mind that the hit overseas is much greater. So the hit to Asian economies and economies that are impacted not just by the higher prices, but the actual physical shortages is much more significant. And that is a drag on GDP growth globally, and that has some spillover into the US and to, thinking about market conditions as well. So I think that's still a safe baseline. Greater or lesser hit is subject to a great degree of uncertainty. And so, I think that's the picture. The US is probably going to be the prettiest horse in the glue factory, as we say. It's going to be a rough year for the global economy. The US is relatively well positioned given our own domestic supply of commodities. But I want to kind of also step back. Another thing that put us a little bit on the low side of consensus even before the war was, and this is very relevant, I think, for thinking about state and local governments and the local economies that they serve. We have seen a massive policy whipsaw from what was the passage of 3 significant pieces of industrial policy legislation under the Biden administration: the CHIPS Act, the Infrastructure Bill, and the Inflation Reduction Act, which had a lot of subsidies for renewable energy. Much of that flowed through state and local governments, to pulling back on that, sometimes reneging on contracts that had already been signed with contractors, to a complete and unfettered push for AI. So this is for state and local governments going from working on infrastructure and contracting with infrastructure and renewable energy projects, losing some of that, now having to deal with, data centers and demands for tax abatements and possible demands on resources. So this is not a small thing. The state and local government is 10% of the US economy. And in the last few years, a little bit more than 10%, about 11%, in the last couple of years, it's also been a source of tailwind for the recovery through the expansion of some of these infrastructure programs and the CHIPS Act and so on. We had seen the hiring by state and local governments be a real source of significant jobs growth. So in 2023, it was about 50,000 jobs a month. Then it stepped down to about 25,000 jobs a month. And over the last 12 months, it's been 7,000 jobs a month. So that slowdown reflects the policy pivot and has taken a source of dynamism away from the broader macro backdrop. So when we look at the composition of growth and hiring, and of course, every growth cycle is just a positive feedback loop between hiring and consumer spending. when we look at the structure of hiring, as Mark noted, it's all healthcare. And beyond healthcare, there are like very little in the way of sectors really adding jobs. There's just a lot of reluctance to hire right now. I think that's one of the reactions to some of the policy uncertainty and the trade war. And now we layer on, the Iran war. Will this resolution last? Will it not? So I agree with Mark. It feels like we are resting on a very narrow pillar of a lot of AI enthusiasm holding the market up and driving most of the investment. Outside of AI, actually, business fixed investment is declining. So, it does concern me. The resilience, in other words, I don't think we can just bet on it always continuing. We're taking a little bite out of dynamism each shock we absorb. So I think, it's likely to be another year of growth. High inflation that was already sticky before we came into this, but then you layer on the energy shock, which again is still going to be coming through the supply chain and into the numbers that we see. I think it's going to prevent the Fed from cutting rates. So that's going to be, something that we had expected some relief on interest rates. I don't think they can deliver when inflation is pretty much stuck around 3% instead of their target of 2%. So that's another kind of source of maybe reduced policy space that the U.S. has to cushion any shock from the war. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Julia.
Baton.
Well, and there's many questions that come up, and if I may just briefly say, it seems like there's some consensus, nicely enough, between Julia and Mark. And I just want to particularly note that oil prices were down as low as 80 this morning. That's still up from the 60, 65, so that's about 20 basis up, which leads to 40 basis points, maybe more of inflation, it sounds like, from both Julia and Mark, which is slightly under 3 or maybe around 3, but that's a question of whether, in fact, it holds there. And what happens, therefore, most importantly, which I think both we need to come back to, both you, Julia, and Mark, what are your expectations of 10-year treasuries and also the Fed's actions? I know mortgage rates for some are prognosticators out there, including myself, are saying by the end of the year it could come down under 6. If so, that would be a big, big positive for that important sector of the economy. But I agree with both of our economists. There's great uncertainty despite both of you believe say there will be growth, Mark, between 2 and 2.5%, Julia, 1.5%. That's good growth, but it's not up to our potential potentially. And there are implications that we're going to hear more about from our state and local government folks, because they're particularly, and I agree with you, Julia, here, hit by this policy whipsaw. So thank you both for setting us up. And now back to you, Bill, to introduce our next panelist.
Well, thank you, Susan. And I see going by in this morning's headlines, the president says that Iran has agreed to an unlimited suspension of the nuclear program, all this pending their final negotiations. So things would seem to be moving in the right direction. Rochester, Minnesota, Mayor Norton, when we've talked before, you're at one of the epicenters of eds and meds investment, especially on the med side, but you've also talked about the impact of inflation on your budget, on the city. So what's going on from a nice mid-sized booming city in the upper Midwest?
Well, thank you for that description. We are indeed booming and growing. And I always need to qualify my remarks in that I'm not an economist. I'm a mayor, but the economy definitely impacts what we do in the cities. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what's been happening. And as you point out, cities have to plan well in advance their capital projects. And as you mentioned, we are growing quite a bit right now, which might be different than some other cities, but it is impacting our budgets in ways that our economists may have expected, but maybe here at home we didn't. And that is that we are seeing significant cost pressures for 2026 and 2027. The traditional 3% annual inflation assumption that we work on no longer reflects the current conditions. Our project teams are having to apply higher escalation factors that better match today's market, and then they're updating cost estimates much more frequently than they did in the past. Sometimes value engineering can be used, but of course you have to be careful there because the community has been told about a particular project, goals have been set, expectations have been set, and if it doesn't resemble what you've said, that can cause problems with residents. We're also finding that our projects are far more complex to deliver, but we are continuing to adapt and move those projects forward anyway. I will say a couple of the factors that we're seeing that are really impacting Rochester right now, which was talked about, which are materials. And so when we're growing and doing a lot of construction as we are in our community, the steel tariffs have increased cost, created bidding volatility. The contractors that we're using are having larger contingencies built into those accounts, which has, it accounts for some price swings, which raises costs for the city. And then since 2020, construction input prices have increased more than 43% with structural metal products. They're up over 63%. So in addition to just the steel and materials costs that we also have the impact that's been mentioned here, which is fuel and energy costs, which are significant. So the rising diesel prices are increasing the cost of heavy infrastructure construction. We have a lot of cranes out here. It affects those costs. The fuel escalation costs probably affecting more than just transportation. It's affecting other factors that sometimes you're not always aware of and don't expect. But what we're seeing is it really reflects national trends. And so heavy highway and road projects have remained pretty stable, but our large vertical construction projects, such as our recent wastewater reclamation plant build, our bus rapid transit line we're putting in, and a sports complex, we're just seeing the costs escalate. Wage inflation is also running at 4 to 5% annually. Tariffs are adding another 5 to 8% to material costs. So our total projections are escalating 6 to 10%. And you can imagine the impact that is on a city budget, which is very tight anyway. And add to that labor shortages and competition. So we are seeing a shortage of skilled trades employees. And also the number of contractors that are out for bid is less than it's been. And so fewer bidders reduces competition, increasing prices, of course. And so we're hearing that the industry is expected to need about 500,000 additional workers in 2026. And in a city that needs those workers, it's, of course, a real concern. And I would say just an example would be our bus rapid transit project. We had a recent bid package go out. We received exactly one bid, and it exceeded the amount that had been planned for that project. So, of course, that's a lot of going back to the drawing board. And we know that tariffs on materials, higher transportation costs, tight timelines, labor shortages, limited contractor availability are all impacting that. And so we're concerned. Housing is another area that every city deals with. We're expecting more than 6,000 units to be built in the next bit. We've approved them and are waiting for them to get started. But financial feasibility is a real issue we're hearing from the developers. High interest rates and construction costs require more complex financing and longer timelines. And that's affecting our ability to get even approved projects done. So we're continuing to move forward. We have a strong foundation in Mayo Clinic. They have a $6 billion project they're working on right now. And I cannot imagine how all the things that I've just talked about and you've all talked about that are affecting our economies, how that's affecting what was once supposed to be a $5 billion project that's probably creeping closer to 6 and beyond. And they're having to probably do all the things that I just talked about the city's having to do and more. But we're in a good position, a growing city, and we're using all the tools that we have at our disposal. We have lost some of the funding expectations at the federal level that we had been counting on, but we will do the best we can moving ahead as projects are more expensive, more complex, and they require longer to deliver. So we're doing our best and interested to hear the rest of the discussion today.
Well, thanks. And one quick question before we turn to Brian, because I'm going to ask the same question for Brian too. In Rochester, is there any of the COVID money still left in your budget, or is that spent and gone?
Yeah, we talked about this a couple of years ago. Rochester got a very small amount of COVID dollars because of the way they do the formula in the first place. We used that a little bit gradually over time. So we weaned ourselves off of it and it is now gone. So we will not have that moving forward. We anticipated that. We planned for it. Some of the other things we've just talked about, though, we didn't plan for. So we're faced with the federal actions and everything else affecting the economy.
Well, thanks a lot. And Brian and everybody else on the panel will be cycling back to inflation because you're giving us a great ground up view. And so, Brian, I'm wondering, how is inflation affecting the budgets you're seeing coming across your desk right now?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Bill. Happy to be here. I would say while we're not seeing significant budget shortfalls right now, and states have been dealing with inflation for a while, what we're seeing is that budget conditions are tightening across states. States are managing in a tighter environment, although underlying fiscal conditions remain stable even in this tight environment. So I can get into some more of this later, but revenues remain on target for most states. Rainy day funds remain near record levels. Credit ratings are high and debt levels are low. But states are facing a number of pressures. One of the pressures they're facing right now is the slow growth of general fund revenue. This current year, fiscal 2026, is marking the fourth consecutive year slow growth in general fund revenue, and we're expecting another slow growth year next year in fiscal 2027. Just to give you an example, based on our fiscal survey of states, we had revenue growing at 0.3% on a median basis in 26. This slow growth follows 2 years of record high in both 21 and 22 due to the economic growth back then and the impact of the federal COVID-19 aid. So this less revenue growth now is attributed to some less economic growth, coupled with the impact of the recently adopted tax changes. So at the same time, we're seeing less revenue growth. Spending is also slowing, and states are taking steps to curtail spending growth. While the revenue growth has been slowing for a number of years, we haven't seen this as much on the spending side until now. The reason for this is there's a lag in state budgets in recent years have been impacted by their prior revenue year surpluses that they accumulated, and they were using those surplus funds for one-time measures and investing in key priorities. And a lot of those surplus funds have now expired. States are facing spending pressures in a number of areas, including affordability concerns, high medical inflation that affects Medicaid budgets and state employee and retiree healthcare costs. We're seeing pressures in education, including school choice, and also natural disaster responses. When we were looking at state of state speeches and proposed budgets for fiscal 2027, one of the top priorities we kept on seeing come across was this need to address affordability and the rising cost of living. So that's in a number of areas, including housing, childcare, energy costs, healthcare costs, etc. So states are starting to take steps now to address these projected structural gaps, including things like targeted cuts, revenue increases, eliminating vacant positions, and other strategies. So, at the same time, states are contending with the slow revenue growth, increased spending demands. They're dealing with the changes at the federal level, even before the impact from changes from the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. States were dealing with the wind down of the federal COVID-19 aid. I should note that this wind down was expected, and states realized the funds were one time, not ongoing. Regarding the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, most of the initial impact was on the revenue side, whereas the expenditure impacts will start to occur a little bit in fiscal 2027 and further on in the out years. The tax cuts in the bill are already reducing state revenues to the extent that state tax codes conform to these federal changes. On the spending side, states are planning for some of the eligibility changes, reductions and cost shifts for programs like Medicaid and SNAP. And those, like I said, are beginning later this year and will be phased in over multiple years. But, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act changes will be part of state budgeting discussions and decisions for the coming decade. I'll just real quickly talk about, some of our other speakers mentioned the war in Iran, how that's impacting states, and also inflation. Obviously a quickly changing situation day by day. But one thing we could see for energy producing states is a boost to severance tax revenues due to the higher energy prices. You could potentially see people drive less, the gas prices stay elevated, so that could reduce some gas tax revenues for states. Typically when we see inflation, a lot of times we'll see a short-term boost to sales tax revenue due to increases in the price of goods. Some of the volatility in the stock market could also impact things like capital gains. And then the spending side, we could see increased costs, the construction projects and other programs like Mayor Norton mentioned as well. So, closing out, I guess I'd say, states are facing challenges and a lot of ongoing uncertainty, both economic and federal level. However, state fiscal conditions are stable. I should say too that, states did take a number of steps in recent years to kind of bolster their fiscal resilience, including things like paying down debt, making additional pension payments, using one-time funds for one-time measures, and increasing the size of their rainy day funds.
Thanks, Brian. We'll return to some of these topics when we get to the Q&A.
Brian, it seems to me as though this is kind of a difference, thinking longer term in terms of the way states and then localities, but particularly states, are responding to potential budget pressures going forward by being precautionary. This kind of precautionary, careful budgeting of, you said, using one-time funds for one-time spending, pay down bills, rainy day funds. This feels to me different than it was 10, 20 years ago. Do you believe that there is a long-term shift to more responsible state budgeting?
I think we've seen, some shifts. Even after the Great Recession, we did see a concentrated effort to build up rainy day funds and reserves. So states, rainy day funds were heavily used during the Great Recession. Then states started to build them up even before COVID-19. And then, what we saw, after COVID-19, when states were initially assuming that revenues would sharply decline, and we did see some initial declines, but then when revenues growing so sharply, we were seeing record growth along with the federal COVID-19 aid. So, those kind of things allowed states to be proactive, and they used some of that revenue growth to take steps like, put it into rainy day funds and do some of those other measures. So I think states, recognize that double-digit revenue growth that we saw in that 21 and 22 time period wasn't going to continue. It wasn't sustainable. So, they took measures to,
So that's great. Better budgeting. And we can thank Volcker Foundation and Bill for some of the good work on this. I think.
Right. The Volcker Alliance has been campaigning for that for 10 years and continues to do so. And it's notable that states and municipalities have been deleveraging the past few years, not just in terms of paying down debt, but also paying down pension debt. So there's been a trend toward more responsible budgeting for sure. And with that, this is a reminder that you're tuned into special briefing from Penn IUR and the Volcker Alliance. Thanks again to the Travelers Institute, the Volcker Alliance, and members of the Penn IUR Advisory Board for your support. And don't forget, you can follow today's episode and all of our other special briefings on our websites, on the Special Briefing Podcast, and the Penn IUR YouTube channel. And now, Natalie, in addition to all the big news today, I know you also have AI and data centers on your mind, deleveraging, responsible budgeting. What's going on in our $4 trillion municipal market?
Right. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate being here. It's nice to see everyone. So shifting over to the municipal bond market, as many of the attendees are aware, there has been record bond market volume in 2024 and 2025. 2024 had 514 billion, 2025 580 billion, almost 200 billion higher than 2 years ago. Much of it is new money for projects. The first quarter of 2026 looks like this pace is continuing and likely to continue. Some analysts are forecasting at some point reaching as close as $1 trillion in annual borrowing. I don't have an opinion on that one. Education, transportation, electricity, and utilities were the sectors that showed significant gains over prior years. Some of this is due to a response of the spend down of federal stimulus programs. States, as Brian spoke about, entered this time period with reasonable reserves, and they are now picking up on the infrastructure tab. Some of the major, large, older cities are experiencing deficits, however, notably those that have lost population, which I'm going to talk a little bit about. Drivers for the infrastructure needs and wants. After the housing crisis, there was limited migration, but COVID started to shift population around. A good source that I often refer to is the United Van Lines, which does an annual review of outbound and inbound migration from which states. They found that the highest outbound states are currently California, New York, Illinois, New Jersey, and Massachusetts. No terrible surprise there. Inbound states, also no surprise, are Florida, Texas, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Tennessee. People want more space. Some of that is due to COVID. They want a slower pace of living, lower taxes for sure. Remote work is available now, and also a higher amount of retirements. Each of these creates infrastructure needs in different locations. In 2023, it's worth mentioning that people moved away from a very bad hurricane and wildfire season, away from the western states and coastal areas into inland communities where it's also less expensive. Evidence of climate change migration is not just a sub-Saharan Africa event, it's here as well. A counterpoint, which the mayor brought up, is labor and supply chain shortages. Labor shortages are biting into the construction projects. Highly trained electricians, pipe fitters, iron workers, and heavy equipment operators are creating bottlenecks for water and sewer projects, transit, and energy projects. Some of this is also due to deportations, and there's a lot more information about this, but time permitting, I don't think I can get into that. In terms of competition, think data centers and technology. As of November 2025, there was $53.7 billion dedicated to data centers, 139% increase year over year. A publication called Construct Connect is tracking 65 data center projects that are worth $69.2 billion in addition, with potential start dates over the next 6 months. Capital is coming in from private sector tech companies. Amazon, Alphabet, Microsoft, Meta, and Oracle have each announced a cumulative plans for $700 billion in capital spending for 2026. The top 5 states for data center spending, and this is through October 25, Louisiana, Virginia, Mississippi, Texas, and Arizona. So in a sense, if the public sector isn't putting in the energy and the roads and the water, the private sector is going to do it because they want to have those facilities up and running. As a result, the timelines that we are used to seeing are extending, and some projects may be delayed and may see cost overruns. There's some interesting research about the various clocks that are operative in the market today, particularly given the Iran war. Largest issuers with strong project management are also navigating the best, no surprise there. But meanwhile, as our economist mentioned, manufacturing construction is winding down. So I just want to make a few observations about behavioral changes. When under stress, shortages and policy switches are naturally leading to workarounds. A note on the affordability question, which is top of mind for many people and politicians. On home ownership and the availability of availability of affordable housing. From 1989 to 2004, before the financial crisis, homeownership rates rose from about 63.8 to 69.2 in 2004. After the housing crisis, the homeownership had dropped to 65% by 2024. So that's a pretty big drop. Discussion often, in my humble opinion, misses the importance of the student loan overhang, currently at $1.8 trillion, second only to mortgage debt in the United States. The Federal Reserve recently stated that for every $1,000 of student debt, there's a 1.8% decrease in home ownership. Some states and localities have started to take moves to implement programs and ease student debt, whether it's their own employees or within the state. Finally, I know this webinar is sponsored by the Institute for Urban Research, but I want to digress for a moment about farming and fertilizer. Key inputs right now in the farm states for current planting season have risen tremendously in price. That's been discussed, but the chemicals that relate to that support plant health and increase farm productivity have also dramatically risen in price. While the US does produce a lot of these ingredients, sulfur and sulfuric acid, which are critical for fertilizer, comes mainly from the Gulf. Canada also supplies much of the US its potash, but that is subject to 10% tariffs. As a result, farmers may change crops, similar to 2022 during the invasion of Ukraine. Quote, farmers in 2022 decreased planted acreage of corn and wheat, but increased soybean acres, which are less consumptive of those products. Farmers may also just simply skip applying fertilizer, which would weaken soil and productivity. Another quote, when cash is tight, phosphorus and potassium applications, which build the soil reserves over time, are the first things that farmers cut. The point here is that there's a longer time frame in order to actually visually and experientially feel the change in output. One Carnegie Endowment piece mentioned that there's about a 3 to 6 month clock to see a shift from planting practices, and then another couple of months to actually see food prices change. So perhaps by 2027, we may be seeing that. Ironically, we make sure to have oil reserves for strategic purposes, but fertilizer is on a just-in-time basis. A little bit on transportation, which was mentioned. Consumers want to switch to EVs because of high gas prices, but the OBBBA cut the tax credit for American-made EVs, temporarily halted the federal EV charging network, and the credit for installing an EV charger at your home. Also, the high price and scarcity of diesel fuel, aside from airline, affects heavy farm equipment and the usage of heavy farm equipment in the US. Finally, the renewable fuel standard requires blending ethanol with gas, which relies on corn. The farm industry is heavily lobbying, and the states that are agricultural want to keep that standard while the administration is looking hard to weaken it. I would be remiss if I didn't discuss the states and local governments that are benefiting from the higher prices. 9 oil-producing states benefit from severance taxes: Alaska, North Dakota, New Mexico, Wyoming, Oklahoma, West Virginia, Texas, Montana, and Louisiana. Companies as well have each raised their earnings expectations in this area: ExxonMobil, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, Shell, BP, as well as the LNG exporters. The Pew organization has cited 10 states that were above their 15-year revenue trajectories: Alaska, New Mexico, and Wyoming among them. I guess I will just conclude there. There's a lot more to unpack, but I yield the floor over.
Oh, thank you.
Bill, if I may quickly on
Yeah.
Natalie's last point, we keep on hearing, and it's so true, that the United States is an energy producing country, but it's really states, and it's some states that are particularly going to be part of this boom. And Natalie, it was very good to hear that point.
Yes.
Bill?
Oh, absolutely. And I want to get a follow-up not only from Natalie, but from everybody. This is a non-energy question, but Natalie mentioned AI and data centers. Eric Kim from Fitch, our friend and frequent panelist, he's noting that there's a bunch of states considering data center moratoriums, reconsidering tax credits. We posted on the chat for you a Good Jobs First study on state tax credits. How is this going to play out, Natalie and everybody else? Are we
Bill,
going to see some resistance?
Yeah, and Bill, can I just, I want to quote exactly what Eric said, because it's pretty, they're very specific. With states considering data center moratoriums, what's the risk that the growth driver falls flat? Maybe we could start with you, Mark. What's the risk that the growth driver falls flat due to moratoriums?
Good point.
Yeah, it is. That is a very good point. And again, to your earlier point, it is very state specific. So there are some states like Maine, for example, is looking at a moratorium, and others are out there. There's a lot of controversy around the amount of water and electricity that's required to run a data center. Right now, it's, as I said, the private sector is hell-bent on having these things available and up and running. And
so now I put you as a no, it's not going to cause the growth driver to fall flat. Except in the states.
Except in certain states that are
right. Gotcha. All right, Mark, I'm sorry.
Divides we have today.
Yeah, gotcha. Mark, what do you think?
Yeah, I don't think on a nationwide basis, there's many parts of the country that want the data centers. So, go to Alabama. I mean, they want the data centers.
Right.
So it may move from Virginia to Alabama, but we're going to, the economics here are so compelling that I think that they'll win the day. And I do think the AI companies are becoming they're politically astute. They understand this, and they're working on ways to address the concerns. So I think we're seeing the peak of the political opposition to it right now, and it will abate going forward. So I don't view it as obviously there's a lot of different ways this can go, but the most likely scenario is that these data centers get constructed and continue to power growth.
So the other question that we have from Jennifer Andrews from Woodward and Curran, and she's saying, how do you expect the current circumstances, being elevated interest rates and other costs, to affect civil infrastructure projects moving forward? I was noting, Kim, how difficult it is for mayors and others to budget when inflation's uncertain and the numbers are going to be so different. And yet, and this is the question, are you still taking on new infrastructure projects? And then
we are. We're at a time of rapid growth in the community, not just Mayo Clinic, but actually the city itself. Our population continues to grow, and we have to accommodate that. So we are not slowing down, but I don't think that's true of all communities. I have talked to other cities who are pulling back because of the budgetary impacts, and I think we're just able to balance that right now. And of course, given everything that's happening, it's moment by moment. We'll make decisions as we need to based on what's happening.
That's terrific. It's really planning, but then responding to the moment. Brian?
Yeah, we haven't really seen too much of a pullback yet at the state level.
What about the other direction? I'm actually asking, is infrastructure spending, we'll turn to economists as well on this, on the state and city levels, infrastructure spending going to continue at the elevated path that came after some of this infrastructure support from the federal government? Or is it dwindling?
I think you'll see it continue. It might be a slight slowdown. One thing I think will be interesting to watch too is that, tying it back into borrowing and debt, we saw a lot of states use cash for a couple of years for various infrastructure projects when they had such large surpluses. So, there's a chance they may be turning to more debt for some of these projects, but there remains a lot of pent-up demand for infrastructure projects across the board. So I think you'll continue to see infrastructure spending. There might be some instances of pulling back, but I think you'll continue to invest in it.
And Julia, what do you see from the macro perspective on state and local spending going forward?
Yeah, so
on infrastructure, on investment.
Yeah, I was just looking at investment, state and local government investment in the GDP accounts, and we did see this big surge, post infrastructure bill. What we're seeing in the data, given which is aligns with what Brian is saying, it has slowed from a pace that reached as high as 16% year on year to something like 6% year on year. But that's a pace that we saw before the pandemic. So I think that, we could probably, one of the things that we've been assuming, and Natalie touched on this, it's going to go slower, partly because of sort of the cost and supply chain issues that Mayor Norton touched on. Also, the lack of workers. There's no immigrants. Immigrants are intensive in construction activity. So it's just going to mean there's a lower speed limit on the growth rather than, the needs are still there. And so we would expect that it will continue growing, but just much more slowly than that peak growth right after the pandemic when money was really flowing to state and local governments.
Yeah, two of the things to keep in mind is I'm glad Julia, that you looked at those statistics. I was looking at them last night for another piece of research. State and local spending accounts for 75% of non-defense public infrastructure spending in the United States. It's very unusual among international, among global countries. So this is a very critical sector. And the new federalism is turning a lot of spending decisions back to states, counties, cities, school districts. So there's almost of necessity going to be an increase in borrowing and probably in revenue generation, fees, taxes, whatever, over time to meet deferred maintenance, climate needs. There's a lot of unmet needs, and you can see this continuing, and you can see the debt markets really benefiting from that.
Yes, and that's where the prospects potentially for some saying up to $1 trillion. And by the way, new federalism will be the topic for our next special briefing. But back to what we have right now. Mark, do you have additional perspective on infrastructure spending on locals and states?
I'm totally aligned with Julia. I think it's peaked because of the infrastructure legislation passed through, but it will remain elevated at a higher level. The growth rates will just slow, and a lot of it will be debt financed. So the peak of the growth is behind us, but I don't see it falling off to a significant degree.
Moving in a different direction, we have a question from Wendy Patton of Columbus, Ohio, which goes to the K-shaped economy. And that was in part, I heard from several of our speakers about the potential of the K-shaped economy continuing. The question is asking, will the wealthy escape harm as federal cuts hurt the poor and recession damages also potentially hurt working people? So more generally on the K-shaped economy potential, whom shall we start with? Julia, go ahead, please, if you can.
Sure. The K-shaped economy, I think it's a reality. Economists sort of fuss over and debate on kind of the data and the magnitude of this. But certainly, I think part of the resilience in consumer spending we saw last year reflected the record stock market boom fueled by AI enthusiasm. And we could see that in certain credit card spending numbers, that it was really the high income households driving the spending, whereas lower income households were. And I think, the K-shaped economy, to the degree that we are seeing labor supply and hiring really slow down, and that is kind of our income generating machine, then you are relying more on wealth effects to drive growth. And unfortunately, wealth effects they require repeated impulses from the stock market. I think if we look at valuation metrics like, say, the Shiller cyclically adjusted price earnings ratio or other metrics of fundamental valuation, the stock market's never been so concentrated, first of all, in terms of the increase in value over the last couple of years has been extraordinarily concentrated in a handful of technology stocks to a degree we've never seen before. And then if you look at fundamental valuations, they look high, not .com bubble high, but pretty high, second to that. So I do think that that's another vulnerability if we are riding on the wealth effect, one that creates all kinds of societal sort of fragmentation. We certainly see that in our political landscape. And then, just from a, accounting standpoint, can we rely on that year after year? The stock market just continuing to power upward. I think when we look at the AI landscape, there's a lot of questions. There's $1 trillion of announced investment. Do you know at a normal ROI how much money people are going to have to be shoveling out for AI? That's a lot of money in our budget to deliver a normal sort of reasonable ROI.
I have heard estimates that our productivity, if the pricing is correct, would double GNP productivity due to AI alone. Mark, I know you've done a lot of work on this.
With regard to AI specifically?
Economy and fragility, and going forward on the AI economy and growth.
Well, on the K-shape, I think it's undeniable. I mean, one of the statistics that I think is very telling, that based on work I've done, is that folks in the top 20% of the income distribution account for 60% of the personal outlays, and that's skewed. It's always been skewed, but it's become increasingly more skewed, and a lot of it is around the wealth and the wealth effects, and it poses, obviously a bunch of challenges. And I might repeat Julie a little bit, but one is that the economy is very dependent on a very small group of the well-to-do, and they're very tied into the equity market. If those AI stocks don't live up to expectations and we don't get those productivity gains, and there's a sell-off, then there's going to have negative wealth effects, and it's going to hurt the economy, and recession becomes much more likely. And then longer run, I do think you can connect the dots between the skewing of the income and wealth distribution back to a lot of our societal ills and our political fracturing. And that obviously has enormous longer term implications. And I think that's kind of where the questioner was coming from, that, you can take that to the extreme. On AI, quickly, economists view this very differently than the technologists. They look at past history of technology and they say, look, this diffuses slowly enough that we get the benefits of the productivity gains, but we don't lose too many jobs too quickly, and it disrupts the economy. I think that's the most likely scenario, but Susan and I have been a professional economist for 36 years, and I know we got to stay humble on this one. This can go lots of different directions, and we should be prepared for the possibility that those productivity gains come on much faster than anticipated. That's what the technologists are telling us. And if it does, that could be very dystopic to the labor market, and we need to be prepared for that possibility.
Yes, so long-term needs in terms of the K-shape and potential AI outcomes, but productivity gains nonetheless. I think we're out of time, so let me thank the panelists myself and turn it to Bill.
Well, thank you, Susan, and thank you, everybody. Mark said, how much time do you have? Do you have 3 hours? Well, we could continue this for 3 hours, but I think everybody needs to get back to their day jobs. So thank you, Susan. Thank you, panelists again. Thanks to our wonderful audience. There's our panelists up on the screen if you want to contact them. And special thanks to our production team: Megan Schmigdal, Amy Montgomery, Wesley Garrett, Alexa Halim, Noah Wynn-Ritzberg, Natalia Trujillo, and Divine Adenyi. And thank you to the Travelers Institute, the Volcker Alliance, and members of the Penn IUR Advisory Board for your very generous support. We will be back on Thursday, May 14th, with what we think will be a fascinating look at how global cities, states, and provinces can better finance their infrastructure needs, perhaps by taking some cues from the U.S. muni bond market. To bring you that story, we'll have experts from the OECD, NYU, the Government Finance Officers Association, GFOA, and Morgan Stanley, going over some really, really cool new research in this area. And they'll talk about research and real strategies. So until then, I'm Bill Glasgall on behalf of Susan Wachter and the special briefing team, and we'll see you again in May.